The footsteps echoed through the corridor like thunder before a storm. Heavy, deliberate, final. Peter's bare feet moved across the cold tiles of his own home, each step carrying the weight of 365 days of silent suffering. Behind the bedroom door, the sounds of betrayal filled the air. His wife's laughter. Another man's voice. The creaking of the matrimonial bed where sacred vows had been made and broken. For 1 full year, Peter had watched this blind husband charade unfold. 700 different men had crossed his threshold. 700 times his heart had been pierced like a pincushion. Young men, old men, rich men, poor men, his unfaithful wife had welcomed them all while her husband sat in darkness, pretending he could not see the scenes unfolding before his very eyes. The door handle turned slowly. The room fell silent. There, frozen like statues caught in a forbidden dance, lay Purity and an old man whose wrinkled skin told stories of many seasons. The shock on his wife's face was like lightning splitting the night sky. Surprised, my dear wife. Peter's voice cut through the silence like a machete through tall grass. I have been watching you, this entire time. The old man scrambled for his clothes and fled like a hyena caught stealing from the lion's kill. But Purity remained, her mouth open, her eyes wide with the terror of a woman whose secret word had just crumbled to dust. But how, you ask, did a church sister who prayed for a godly marriage end up betraying her husband 700 times? How does love become hatred? How does faithfulness transform into the deepest kind of adultery? Come closer, and let me take you back to where this tale of deception, broken trust, and heartbreak began. In the heart of Lagos City lived a man whose wealth could feed 10 villages for 10 seasons. Peter was his name, and money flowed through his hands like water from a broken dam. His business empire stretched across continents, his bank accounts swelled like rivers during the rainy season, and his houses stood tall like ancient baobab trees. Yet this wealthy man carried a burden heavier than all his gold combined. You see, my people, when a man has too much money, he discovers a bitter truth about human nature. Peter had learned this lesson through painful experience. Every woman who smiled at him, every lady who laughed at his jokes, every sister who claimed to love him, behind their eyes, he saw the glint of greed. They loved his bank account more than his heart. They desired his mansion more than his soul. This rich husband had watched relationships crumble like dried leaves when women discovered his true wealth. Some became possessive, others became lazy, thinking marriage to Peter meant a life of luxury without effort. The worst were those who saw him as their personal treasure chest, demanding expensive gifts and living beyond even his generous means. But Peter's greatest fear lay in something darker than gold digging. His business demanded that he travel frequently, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. He had seen too many marriages destroyed by unfaithful wives who used their husband's absence as an opportunity for betrayal. The thought of working hard in foreign lands while his wife entertained other men in his own bed made his stomach turn like sour milk. Night after night, this wealthy man would sit in his empty mansion, surrounded by luxury but starved of genuine love. The marble floors echoed with loneliness. The golden fixtures reflected a solitary figure who had everything money could buy but nothing his heart truly needed. He wondered if there existed a woman who could love Peter the man, not Peter the millionaire. A woman who would remain faithful whether he was home or traveling across oceans for business. The weight of these trust issues pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy load of firewood. He knew that to find true love, he needed to look beyond the surface, to test the very soul of any woman who claimed to care for him. It was then that Peter made a decision that would change everything. He would seek spiritual guidance from the one man in the city known for his wisdom in matters of the heart, Pastor Goodman. Little did he know that this visit would set in motion a plan so elaborate, so deceptive, that it would lead to the very betrayal he feared most. Pastor Goodman was a man whose wisdom ran deeper than the ancient wells of our forefathers. His church stood like a lighthouse in the community, and people traveled from distant villages to seek his counsel on matters of marriage, family, and love. When Peter knocked on his office door that fateful evening, the pastor could see the pain written across the wealthy man's face like scars from old battles. Peter poured out his heart like water from a calabash. He spoke of his loneliness, his fear of gold-digging women, his terror of unfaithful wives who would betray him during his business travels. The pastor listened with the patience of an elder under the village tree, nodding as each word revealed the depth of Peter's suffering. Then Pastor Goodman proposed something that would make even the wisest village council gasp in shock. A plan so controversial, so elaborate, that it seemed to come from the mind of a master storyteller rather than a man of God. "My son," the pastor said, his eyes gleaming with an idea that would change everything, "what if we test her heart before she knows the size of your wallet? What if we present you not as the wealthy businessman, but as a simple, humble man who cannot even see the beauty of her face?" The plan was this: Peter would disguise himself as a blind man. A man with a small business, modest means, and eyes that could not witness beauty or ugliness, wealth or poverty. Only a woman with a pure heart would marry such a man. Only someone who loved the soul rather than the appearance would say yes to a blind husband. Pastor Goodman knew exactly who to approach. In his church choir sang a sister whose voice could make angels weep, Sister Purity. For 3 years, she had knelt at the altar every Sunday, praying for God to send her a godly husband. Her reputation was spotless, her devotion unwavering, her character beyond question in the entire congregation. When the pastor introduced Peter as a humble blind man seeking a wife, Sister Purity's eyes filled with compassion. She saw not disability but opportunity to serve God by loving one of his children who needed extra care. Their courtship was gentle, filled with conversations about faith, dreams, and building a Christian home together. Their wedding day arrived like the first rains after a long drought. The entire church celebrated as Sister Purity, radiant in white, exchanged vows with Peter, who wore dark glasses and carried a walking stick. She promised to love him in sickness and health, in blindness and sight, for richer or poorer. Those early days of marriage bloomed like flowers in springtime. Purity was tender, caring, devoted. She would describe the sunset to her blind husband, guide his hands to feel her face, cook his favorite meals with love that seasoned every bite. Have you ever had to test someone's loyalty? Have you ever wondered if someone truly loved you for who you are inside? Let me know how in the comments, because what happened next would test not just loyalty, but the very foundations of this marriage built on deception. My people, there is a saying among our elders: the true character of a person reveals itself when they think no one is watching. For 2 beautiful months, Sister Purity had been the perfect wife. She would wake before dawn to prepare Peter's breakfast, speaking to him with honey-sweet words, guiding his hands with tender patience. The marriage felt like a gift from heaven itself. But on the first day of the 3rd month, something shifted in the air like the wind before a terrible storm. It began with small things that cut deep like tiny thorns. Purity's voice, once soft as a mother's lullaby, became sharp and impatient. When Peter asked for help finding his clothes, she would suck her teeth in annoyance. "Can't you feel around for them yourself? I'm not your servant," she would snap, her words stinging like the bite of red ants. The meals that had once been prepared with love became scarce and cold. Peter would sit at the dining table, his hand searching for the plate that never came. "There's bread in the kitchen," Purity would call from the sitting room, her voice carrying the same tone one might use for a bothersome child. "Get it yourself." This unfaithful wife began to withhold food like a punishment. While she feasted on expensive meals, chicken, rice, fresh fish, Peter would find only stale bread and cold water waiting for him. The man who could buy the finest restaurants in the city sat hungry in his own home, pretending he could not see his wife's cruelty. But Peter's heart broke most when he listened to her conversations with friends who visited. "My husband is such a burden," Purity would whisper, thinking her blind husband couldn't hear. "Can you imagine being tied to someone who can't even see? I have to do everything for him. Sometimes I wonder what I got myself into." These words pierced Peter's soul like spears thrown by skilled warriors. Here was the woman who had sworn to love him in sickness and health, now treating his supposed blindness like a curse she had to bear. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday evening when Purity announced she would be attending a night vigil at church. Pastor said we need to pray for the community, she explained, her voice suddenly sweet again. I'll be back in the morning. Peter listened as her footsteps faded into the distance. But something felt wrong, like the silence before lightning strikes. His heart told him that his wife was not heading to any church that night. Hours passed. Peter sat in the darkness, waiting. When Purity returned at dawn, she smelled of perfume that wasn't hers and carried herself with the guilty weight of someone hiding secrets. Her explanation was hurried, her eyes avoiding his face even though she believed he couldn't see her deception. The prayers were so powerful, she lied, her voice trembling slightly. We prayed until sunrise. But Peter knew better. The night vigils became more frequent, every Tuesday, every Friday, sometimes on weekends. Each time, Purity would return with new lies, new excuses, and new scents clinging to her clothes like evidence of betrayal. The wealthy man's heart was breaking piece by piece, but he maintained his disguise. He had to know how far this deception would go. He had to see just how deep his wife's betrayal would sink. Little did he know that the worst was yet to come, and the night vigils were just the beginning of a darkness that would swallow their marriage whole. What happens when evil finds courage in darkness? What happens when a cheating wife discovers that her husband cannot witness her sins? My people, prepare your hearts for a tale of betrayal so deep it would make the ancestors weep. The fake night vigils were only the beginning. Like a disease that spreads from one small wound to consume the entire body, Purity's unfaithfulness grew bolder with each passing week. The woman who had once been afraid to lie about visiting a friend now crafted deceptions as elaborate as spider webs. One evening, the sound of a car engine broke the silence of their home. Peter sat in his chair, pretending to read Braille, when he heard his wife's voice at the front door. But she was not alone. A man's deep laughter echoed through the hallway, a stranger's voice in their sacred space. Don't worry about him, Purity whispered to her companion, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed her secret was safe. He's blind. He can't see anything. Peter's heart stopped like a clock whose hands had been broken. His wife had brought another man into their matrimonial home. Into the house where they had exchanged vows. Into the bedroom where they had made promises before God. The footsteps moved toward their bedroom. The door closed. And Peter sat in his chair, his hands trembling like leaves in a storm, forced to listen to the sounds of his wife's adultery happening just meters away. This became the new pattern of their cursed marriage. Different men, different nights, but always the same devastating ritual. Peter would sit in his chair, maintaining his blind husband charade, while strangers violated the sanctity of his home. Young men in their 20s, old men with grey beards, businessmen in expensive suits, laborers with calloused hands, Purity welcomed them all. Can you imagine the pain of watching your spouse cheat while pretending you can't see? Can you understand the torture of a husband who must remain silent while his heart is being torn apart like cloth in the hands of a madwoman? The psychological warfare was more brutal than any physical beating. Peter counted each betrayal like a prisoner counting days on a cell wall. 10 men. 50 men. 100 men. The number grew like weeds in an abandoned garden, choking out any remaining love between husband and wife. Some nights, Purity would bring 2 men at once. Other nights, she would entertain her guests in the living room while Peter sat pretending to sleep in his chair. The disrespect was complete, the humiliation absolute. She had turned their home into a den of adultery, confident that her blind husband would never discover her shameful secrets. The wealthy man who could afford the finest hotels in the world was now a prisoner in his own mansion. His wife had become a stranger, a woman whose appetite for betrayal seemed to have no limit. Every creak of the bed, every whispered conversation, every lie she told him the next morning, they all added weight to the burden crushing his spirit. Peter began to document each betrayal in his mind. He knew the voices, could distinguish between the regulars and the newcomers. The total climbed higher and higher, 300, 400, 500 men. By the end of that cursed year, the number had reached 700 different men who had shared his wife's bed. 700 betrayals. 700 broken promises. 700 reasons why their marriage had become a living nightmare. But even the strongest tree must eventually break when the storm becomes too fierce. Peter was approaching his breaking point, and when that moment came, the truth would explode like thunder splitting the sky. And so we returned to that moment of truth that shattered everything like a clay pot dropped from a great height. The bedroom door swung open with the force of a man who had carried silence for too long. There they were, Purity and the old man whose weathered skin spoke of many decades of life, frozen in their act of betrayal on the matrimonial bed that had witnessed 700 such violations. The shock on Purity's face was like lightning illuminating a dark sky. Her mouth fell open, her eyes grew wide as saucers, and her entire body trembled like a leaf caught in a hurricane. For the first time in their entire marriage, she was truly seeing her husband, not the blind man she had deceived, but Peter, the man whose heart she had murdered piece by piece. You can see." The words escaped her lips like the last breath of a dying person. "All this time, you could see everything." The old man scrambled for his clothes like a thief caught in broad daylight. His aged limbs moved with surprising speed as he gathered his scattered garments and fled through the window, disappearing into the night like smoke from a dying fire. The coward left behind nothing but the stench of shame and the echo of his panicked breathing. Peter stood in the doorway, his dark glasses finally removed, his walking stick discarded. The disguise that had protected him from gold diggers had instead revealed the true monster sleeping beside him every night. Purity fell to her knees, her hands stretched toward her husband like a beggar pleading for mercy. "Please, Peter, please forgive me. I didn't know. I thought I can change. I can be the wife you deserve." But some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness to heal. Some trust, once broken, can never be mended like a shattered calabash. Peter looked down at the woman who had shared his name but destroyed his heart, and his silence spoke louder than any words of anger. The marriage that had begun with hope and prayers ended that night with tears and the bitter taste of deception on both sides. Two people who had lied to each other, one to protect his wealth, the other to hide her wickedness, discovered that dishonesty is a poison that kills love from within. This African folktale leaves us with a question that echoes through generations: was Peter's deception justified, or was he wrong from the start? Can testing someone's loyalty through lies ever lead to true love? Even so, what would you do if you were Purity? Or worse still, if you were Peter, going through all that heartbreak at the hands of your supposed church wife? Share your thoughts below, because in matters of marriage, betrayal, and trust, the wisdom of the community often sees clearly than the individual heart. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.